Okay, so we are going to dissect a sheep brain, clearly much smaller than our brains, but the anatomy, the structures that we see in these brains are essentially the same as the structures that we would see in our own brains, just on a much smaller scale.
Brains slimy?
Yes.
They are? Why are they slimy?
They are slimy because going around the brain, there's a fluid called cerebrospinal fluid, and that's what provides nutrients to the tissue of the brain while also maintaining a stable ion concentration.
Oh.
So if you ever hear the brain being described as floating in water, that's why, because the cerebrospinal fluid surrounds the brain and also runs through it. So all these lumpy parts on the brain are called gyri. All little creases or indentations are called sulci. We'll see this deep groove that goes down the center. That's called the longitudinal fissure. So a sulcus is a shallow groove. A fissure is a deep groove.
Okay.
So this longitudinal fissure divides the cerebrum of the brain, which is the big part, into a left cerebral hemisphere and a right cerebral hemisphere. Now, those gyri, those bumps I was talking about, they're important because when there's no lumps on the surface of the brain, it's called lyssencephaly, meaning that they don't have any of those lumps, and then there is severe developmental problems. Okay? So now we take our cerebrum and we divide it up into lobes, and the lobes of the brain correspond to the names of the bones that would generally lie over top of them. So in the front of our head, we have our frontal bone, so that means this region of the brain. Under that bone is the frontal lobe. On the top of the brain, we would have our parietal lobe because we have the parietal bone over top of it. And then on the posterior side of the brain, back here, is the occipital lobes, here and here. Last lobe, because remember there's 4, the last lobe is on the side of the brain. Now this is where it's a little bit different because it's a sheep head and not a human head, because our heads are more rounded, whereas theirs are flat. So the temporal lobe on the sheep brain is a little more to the side, whereas ours would be up a little further. But this is the temporal lobe on the sheep brain.
And it's only on one side?
Nope, one on each side.
Okay.
There and there. Whatever we have on the right, we have on the left. So 2 frontal, 2 parietal, 2 occipital, and 2 temporal.
What's the thing on that chunk on the back?
Okay, so this piece on the back,
Okay.
this piece on the back is the cerebellum. Okay. So it's named, so this part's the cerebrum.
So it's not part of the brain?
It is. It's all part of the brain, but this part's the cerebrum. This is the cerebellum. Cerebellum literally means little cerebrum.
Okay.
Okay, it looks like a cauliflower
So
almost.
why isn't that a lobe?
Because the only part of the brain that has a lobe is the cerebrum. This has an entirely different makeup. It's still made up of neural tissue, but you'll notice that there's no gyri and no sulci. Instead, you have these flaps of tissue called folia, and they kind of stack up on each other like poker chips.
Okay.
Where it extends down the center and kind of bulges out. We call that section of it the vermis, which means worm. And you can kind of follow it. It squiggles back and forth down the center, much like a worm would look.
It looks a little intestine-y to me.
I could see that. You're not wrong. Then you have a left.
So when someone has shit for brains,
I'm so glad you said it and not me. Oh, goodness. Now I lost my train of thought. Longitudinal fissure. Transverse fissure goes around the temporal lobe here. So it's that deep indentation. I don't want to rip it apart, but this indentation that would go all the way around the temporal lobe like that.
Okay.
Okay. This piece that you see sticking out the back, that's the extension to the spinal cord. So that's where the spinal cord comes in. Okay. Now, usually inside the body, these have been removed from a body, so they do not have the coverings that you would normally have that attach the brain to the bones.
I thought they were floating around.
Well, essentially you have a covering, and then the brain, so you have your skull, and then lining the inside of the skull is like a thick membrane like this called dura mater. And dura mater is going to basically wrap around the brain like this, wrap around the spinal cord, and then the skull bone goes right on this. But in between all of those layers is all that fluid. So it's floating in fluid, but it has all these protective coverings.
Okay.
Does that make sense? So that outer dura mater has been removed from most of this. Believe it or not, it's still in the cavity somewhere else. But you could see little pieces of it left. Like you could see pieces of it left on the brain here. Underneath the dura mater, there's another thin layer of meninge called the arachnoid mater. And I can actually get my probe under it and lift it up. It's a clear membrane. Can you see that? And that's the arachnoid mater. They call it arachnoid because when you look at it under a microscope, it has little fibers that look like a spider's web.
Okay.
So you can actually peel that layer off. And then there's a layer that you really can't see, but we know it's there because you see all these black lines. Those black lines are capillaries. So the capillaries are embedded.
It smells so bad.
Are embedded in a third membrane, but look what happens when I try to pick up that membrane. It actually starts to break away the brain matter. That's called the pia mater, the third innermost layer there. You really can't separate it. Okay, gonna flip it over. You ready? Okay, so they look very different, right?
They're both flipped over?
They're both flipped over. So this is the underside of the brain, but this piece has a section of dura mater that's remaining. This one does not.
Okay.
So I'm going to take off the dura mater so that they look the same. But what I want to show you before I remove the dura mater is this right in the center. Doesn't look like much. It looks like it's just another lump in this flap of tissue. But this is actually the pituitary gland, which is a huge gland that controls your endocrine system, all of the hormones in your body. So I'm going to remove this piece. Once you remove it, though, you're not going to see the pituitary gland again. And what I'm doing is, attached to the bottom here, there's lots of little nerves. So I'm cutting it in a way that leaves the nerves intact. Okay. We're just going to put that on the side. Just leave it over there.
By me?
Yep. Okay, so now so on the underside of the brain, we could see some of the cranial nerves, which are any of the nerves that extend from the brain. So up here, underneath the frontal lobe, here and here, these are olfactory bulbs, which extend to the olfactory nerves. That's cranial nerve number 1. Unfortunately, we cannot see cranial nerve number 2 very well here because they've been cut. They're attached to the back of each eye, so they are probably with whatever eyes these brains went to. But you could see where they were cut from. See this section right in the center here? It protrudes out a little. It would normally look like an X, where coming from this point, you would have a nerve extending out this way and another extending out this way, one to each eye. That's the optic nerve, which is cranial nerve number 2. Where they meet in the middle is called the optic chiasma, and then where you follow them back into the brain is called the optic tract.
Okay.
That's what brings the impulses from the optic nerve to the occipital lobes of the brain. The optic tracts travel all the way back. Now remember, sitting over top of this was the pituitary gland. So connecting the pituitary gland to the brain is this piece right here called the infundibulum, and that is attached to the mammillary body. And you could see it in both places, infundibulum and mammillary body. These are resting right on the midbrain, which is this middle section here. The middle section is the first part of a part of the brain that we call the brainstem. The brainstem connects the cerebrum to the spinal cord. It starts with the midbrain. These are called the cerebral peduncles of the midbrain. That's a real word.
Okay.
I'm not kidding. Then the next part of the brainstem is the pons, which is this lump here. And then this funnel shape is the medulla oblongata.
I've heard of that.
Yes. It controls emotions as well. And then back here is the spinal cord. So this is your brainstem connecting the cerebrum to the spinal cord.
Okay.
Okay. So some of the cranial nerves are a little bit more challenging to see than that olfactory one.
I just got a question.
Yeah.
Like, if I'm not going to be a brain surgeon, why in the world would I need to know this?
Because each cranial nerve controls a specific function in the body. So the olfactory nerve is what gives you your sense of taste, because you have olfactory receptors in your nose, sense of smell, sorry. You have sensory receptors in your nose that are finding chemicals in the air that have a smell to them, and it's sending an impulse to the parts of the brain via the olfactory nerve so that the brain can interpret them so that you know what you're smelling. Same thing for the optic nerve. Without our optic nerve, we wouldn't see. Some of the other nerves that have, I'll tell you some of their specific functions as well as I think of them as we go through some of them. I'm not going to show you all the cranial nerves because, well, one, they're not all here. They're ripped off. And two, you're going to be covering that both in lecture and lab. So you don't have to identify all of them. We'll just identify some here. The others will be visible on your diagrams and on the APR module. So this cranial nerve number over here, this is cranial nerve number 3. There should be another one over here. You see where it was kind of cut off from? See that little guy? Mm-hmm. It looked like this. This is cranial nerve number 3. This is called your oculomotor nerve. This is one of the nerves that gets your eyeballs to move back and forth in different directions. And we have 3 nerves that actually have to work together in order to get your eyes to move in different directions. Another nerve that we could see here runs alongside of the spinal cord. It's called the spinal accessory nerve, this one here. And this is cranial nerve number 11. The other one that I wanted to show you is not here, but it's left on here, to be totally honest. See these big ones that are coming out the side? Mm-hmm. This is called the trigeminal nerve. This nerve controls a lot of your facial expressions. They're named the superior colliculi. And then if I go down a little further...
Do you make people memorize all this?
Yeah, always.
Oh, good God.
Then these pieces right below the butt cheeks, the seat that it's on, are the inferior colliculi. All 4 together makes up the corpora quadrigemina. Do you want to know what it does?
Not really, but go ahead.
Okay. So the superior colliculi give you the reflex where if you see something in your peripheral vision, you usually turn and look at it. Mm-hmm. That reflex comes from these guys.
Okay.
If you hear something, so say you hear somebody walking down the hall and you turn your head to look to see what it is, that's a reflex that comes from the inferior colliculi. Dr. Clitty, which one do you want to cut in half?
I feel like this one is like a poor specimen and this is a fine-looking specimen.
Oh!
In terms of brains.
Look what I could show you here. See how this part is darkened?
Yeah.
Okay, this is where the tissue of the brain started to die.
So this was an old goat.
It could have been an old goat, yeah. So there was a bleed that probably happened in some of the blood vessels coming out this way, and the brain tissue here actually started to die away. So that's why it's blacker there. And this one does not have.
So is this what happens when we have traumatic head injuries?
A stroke.
Concussions?
Stroke.